Thinking about how you think. Josh, here's what I mean by this. So in my crude drawing, what I have right here is I have these two discs, and I call these the foundations of belief. These foundations of belief, someone would adopt by various things that they've seen. So in other words, you have down here is what I would call like real world with feedback. Do my beliefs, are they affirmed by what I'm seeing, or are they disaffirmed by what I'm seeing? Anyways, you have various, let's say points of confirmation or points that refute the belief that either support or tear down the belief. Ideally, with time, people will generally want their foundations of belief to be supported, because whenever things blows up, it's painful. Like upstairs, it hurts to do it. Anyways, these various, I would say, foundations of belief form a reality upon which the mind will operate on. And you've heard, whenever you hear people talk about like, lenses of how you look at reality, or ways that you view the world, or like frameworks, this is kind of the same like back-end human software, a human operating system software that creates this. Where it gets interesting is this. So this right here. So again, I have like, these beliefs or whatever, right? That support, kind of like a worldview or someone's reality enforced by various external events. They either confirm or disprove it. This right here, I've tried to draw right here, but smaller. And the reason I did that is I wanted to comment right here on, there's this way, and this is what I mean when I say thinking about how you think about things, where it's like this meta level, where you might have these various sources that you include, but we are bombarded with information nowadays. And so just as we can include sources, we have to exclude so many more. And so we have to have heuristics that we program ourselves with in order to make sense of the overload of data, because if we looked at everything, nothing would get done. There's just too much out there. And so my comment on this is that I call this concept, like, you have like this meta belief level right here. And this is if you want a silly example of this, consider, let's say, politics nowadays is an excellent example, where people will become so dedicated and closed-minded, where, let's say, a liberal will only get his or her news from MSNBC or the New York Times, just like a conservative might only get their news from Hannity or Fox News. That's not to say there won't be kernels of truth in Fox or MSNBC or whatever source someone is looking at, but it is to say that this exclusion is problematic. And you see, if people operate under this meta belief that they will only look at sources that they consider to be kosher, you will exclude, and this is what I'm trying to draw here, other points of data that are coming in from the real world and that are critically important. And the reason for this, the reason this is bad, is that these pieces of data right here would otherwise destabilize or possibly destroy these beliefs that, someone builds their mind on. This is painful. This sucks. Trust me, like it is not fun to go through this. But the reason this is important, or the reason you want this to occur, is that this is the only way we can learn and correct a mistake before it becomes a disaster. Silly example. I'm fond of saying, and again, hat tip to Bloom on this, Minerva's owl only takes flight at dusk, or said slightly less silly. You don't want to have your come to Jesus moment and think, oh my God, I need to clean up my diet and start eating healthy, when you're being wheeled into the operating room for a quadruple bypass. By that point, it's too late. The damage has been done. Maybe you'll survive, but if you needed to make a change, you needed to make the change far, far earlier, as far as that goes. And so by allowing your mind to be open, even if it comes at the cost of vulnerability, and the vulnerability is, destroying, or having your beliefs, blown up, especially deeply held beliefs, that's a sacrifice. That's what you have to pay. But what you get back is you get a better read on reality. And if you go back one more second to this thing, by allowing your meta belief to be open and to be flexible, it allows you to at least entertain the fact there might be other ideas coming in, even if they're preposterous, but there might be some truth or some version of the truth of that you can then incorporate into your own thing. But if you exclude all of this, and remember, all this will be valid, and focus only on these things, especially if you've got a snake in the garden somewhere in here, think like, trust the experts or whatever, right? Because if anything's shown us in the last few years, is the experts are totally useless. But if you believe, these people to no end, then your heuristic might be leading you down a bad path.
Yeah, so if I'm getting this right, you have your worldview. And then there's kind of subcategories of those inputs that have developed your worldview. But we're being constantly exposed to new ideas and new quote unquote facts every single day. And through our past ways that we've developed our current worldview, it's kind of the filtration method that looks at all data that we see today. I identify, not me personally, but let's say there's someone who considers themselves a Republican or a Democrat, and they only follow those two news sources because that is my identity. This is my group of people. So why would I not think like them? And so that is a closed mind, as Alan Bloom would say, because your identity, aka your Democratic Party, shifts its view, you're forced to shift your view too, because you're only allowed, or your only filtration method comes from these sources of information.
Yeah. In other words, like, you have to be willing to make the sacrifice to sacrifice your own beliefs. And while it can be painful and hard to do at times, this is what opens the door to allowing yourself to grow and to root out the bad ones and let in the good ones. Because if you don't do that, think back to you know, that quip from or that scene from the Colonel, the AI Colonel, saying, not even natural selection can take place in this situation when people retreat into their own private little worlds, leaking only, their little truths, or afraid of a larger truth is kind of the way to say it. And just to be clear, like, it's hard, Josh. It's hard to have these moments, but either way, who's the one that says, help me out here? I think it's Rickards. You are free to ignore reality, but you're not free to ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. That's going to come and bite you in the ass. And if you want to do that, great, so be it. Yeah.
This is why it's so important to have an open mind and be curious about things, because if you are only accepting, or I mean, it's not even if you're being curious, most people simply do not have the time. All you do is on your way home from work, you go home and you watch a little bit of news. I mean, why wouldn't you? Because that's like, why would the news lie to me? Like, there's no rational reason for the news to lie to me, so I'm going to take it at face value. And then when you're getting to a top, let's say you're at the gym and you kind of get into a debate with somebody about a certain, let's just call it medicine or war or anything that is politically unpopular today, you're just going to regurgitate a few of the lines that you remembered on the news, because why would the news lie to you? That's your rational thought process, and you don't even think that there's a potential that the news is not telling the truth, because that's what you're predeceived to think. And that could lead you down a completely false narrative where your entire identity and everything that you're saying is based upon false beliefs. And we're just saying it's very difficult to come in and change that. It is more than difficult to throw your beliefs on a desk and 360 it, spin it off into the corner, is just such a drastic change to everything that you are as a person, especially if you're older. I mean, you do not see older people often making a complete change in the way that they think. Like, if someone's been a Democrat or a Republican for the past 20 years, how many of them do you know that has made the change? I don't know any.
Yeah, the two things that come to mind is Scott Adams oftentimes will say people are assigned their opinions. He is, I think, 100% correct, or said slightly differently. And if you go back to that scene that I like so much from Metal Gear Solid 2, that's the proof of your incompetency right there. Did you think that, or was that something Snake told you? In other words, the AI is basically demonstrating that the user, you, lack the capacity to exercise free will. Anyways, I would also go on to say that, and this isn't to say that heuristics are bad. Like, you've got to have ways to filter through the information. It's the heuristics we have are both necessary and insufficient. That's the conundrum. In other words, we have to use them, but they're woefully inadequate for the use that we have to apply them to. But we cannot not use them. And so this is kind of, this burden where you have to keep constantly thinking and thinking and thinking, and it's hard to do. Like, Josh, you made the comment, it's the older you get, the more you get set in your ways. I would say, yes, the word I would use is you have to be flexible and elastic, which means, you've got to have good mental stamina in order to think about this stuff and to consider new things. And at the same time, too, just because something's new doesn't mean you should automatically accept it either. Again, hat tip to Bloom, when he talks about the great books tradition, I think this is basically using, the wisdom of our ancestors, the wisdom of the species, to basically bundle it all together and say, okay, well, listen, we don't quite know what the future holds, but for the past, 100 years, for the past 1,000 years, for the past whatever, right? These have been some common themes that have served humanity well. Not to go too much into the macro concept here, but gold's a good example of this, or whatever, right? And yes, you can't sell gold from point A to point B, but the concept of having some sort of reserve asset that inspires confidence, and confidence is the true reserve asset. It's a true psychological reserve asset. I think there's something. I definitely think there's something to that. Say something like this, Josh. Say like the way the elites do it is they trick you into tricking yourself. Like you are the best person to fool you, and the elites know this. And the elites, they play you like a fiddle. The songwriter from Under Silver Lake does an excellent job of putting this all in perspective, where he looks straight at the camera, looking at you, the audience, and he basically says that your entire culture, your art, your writing, your songs, are nothing but the figments of other men's imaginations with ambitions far greater than you will ever understand. The best person to fool Josh is Josh. The best person to fool Justin is Justin, and the best person to fool you is you. And in order to make this work, and I think the elites know this, is you don't necessarily want to try to directly fool someone. You'll be found out. Rather, if you can engage the person into fooling themselves, it's all the easier. And I think the way you engage the person, or one of the best and most effective ways into engaging the person into fooling themselves, is you limit the information that they'll pay attention to. And in doing so, the information they actually pay attention to, if you can control, manipulate, or otherwise influence, you can basically, and assuming they're not going to consider any other sources, or at least any other sources until it's too late, you have a tremendous amount of implied control over the person, because the person that you wish to control is essentially not deluding themselves, but is limiting the scope of their horizon, limiting the scope of the facts that they'll consider. And if they're only considering the facts you purport to give to them, it's a good position to be in. You have a lot of power.